Here we are. Finally moved out of the Middle Ages and into the English Renaissance. But that was quick, wasn't it? Well, to be honest, we do pass over quite a bit of time. We are now moving into our second book. I hope this is visible here, right? The Norton Anthology of English Literature, 10th edition, 16th century. I don't know why this doesn't show. Kind of going back and forth. Well, enough of that. 16th century, early 17th century, has a woman looking at a candle. So, what's going on? Last we were together, we were at the very late part of the 14th century. Chaucer and the Gawain poet, roughly in this late period of the late 1300s. Okay. Now, one of the things that you may or may not know, and there's probably most of us have never studied what's called the 100 Years' War, which takes place during that last time period that we paid almost no attention to the war. Okay, Chaucer was involved in it, actually. He was taken prisoner at one point during that war. Okay. Another thing happened, though, that is very important politically, and that is the deposing of Richard II. Okay. Now, Shakespeare has a whole series of histories that he wrote, some of which are quite famous, of course. Richard II was a good play, right? And then Richard II, when he was deposed, he is replaced by Henry IV. And therefore, we get Henry IV, parts 1 and part 2, and then Henry V, right? What happened? Now, forget about Shakespeare for a second. What happened, though, is that a precedent was established. And the precedent is that a king can be deposed. Okay, if the king is somehow not fit to rule. Okay, and that, of course, is a very subjective standard. Right? That is a very subjective standard, both in our present time as well as in the past. And to make a long and very complicated story incredibly short, right, as I like to do, the middle part of the 15th century, middle late part, the second half of the 15th century, was very much concerned with what is called the War of the Roses. Ultimately, because, and one could make this argument, historians talk back and forth about this, the principle, though, of a just and competent king, right, or the argument, shall we say, that you can get rid of one who is not, opened the door very widely, by the way, for people to argue, hey, this person is no good, right? Now, the War of the Roses roughly went from about 1455 to 1487, concerning two major houses, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. York wore the white roses, Lancaster were identified with the red roses. Okay. They both houses, sorry, not literal homes, both families had claims to being the rightful heir. They all traced their lineage eventually back to Edward III. Right, that seems to be the key figure there. Edward III was Richard II's father. Okay, so everybody wanted to make a claim to the English throne somehow says we're legit because we go back as a descendant to Edward III. Okay. Now, at the end of this war, a man by the name of Henry Tudor who was aligned with the House of Lancaster. He's married into it. Defeats Richard III, another Shakespearean character, at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. And this basically brings the war to a close. Right? There's some other stuff that goes on, but it's never really so serious after that. Okay, so Henry Tudor, when he ascends to the throne, is Henry VII. Now, at this point, I don't think it's hard to imagine that, quite honestly, it becomes like super, super, uber, duper important to have a clear line of succession. A clear line of succession. So Henry VII has a son. And in fact, he arranges for a marriage of his son to a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, when his son is still very, very young. This son is named Arthur. Arthur dies. Very young. People did, right? People just simply did. Well, in the immortal words of Princess Di, she had an heir and a spare. Right? Henry Tudor had an heir, Arthur, but he also had a spare, also named Henry. Now, the arrangement for Catherine to be married to Arthur had to be, well, it was a politically advantageous union. And so Henry VII wanted Catherine to become the wife of his son, Henry. They had to appeal to Rome, the Pope, to get permission to do this, because it was a little icky, marrying your dead brother's wife, right? But they did. They managed to do that. So Henry and Catherine are married. Now we're into the early part of the 16th century. Henry and Catherine are unable to produce a male child that lives past, infancy. If I remember correctly, Catherine was pregnant about 6 times. But only one, a girl named Mary, survived. You need to see this from Henry VIII's point of view. Okay, so Henry VII marries his son Henry. That becomes Henry VIII, married to Catherine of Aragon. Aragon's a region of Spain. Okay, everybody's Catholic, by the way, at this point, or for the most part. Henry has no heir. England doesn't have women rulers, right? So he's very unhappy about his situation, and he appeals to the Pope to get an annulment, not a divorce. There's no such thing. Get an annulment to say that the marriage never existed. Well, Henry may be the king of England, but Catherine's attached to Spain, and quite frankly, Spain's a pretty powerful country too in these days, right? The times that we're talking about. And I won't get into the head of the Pope at that time, but I can imagine, oh my gosh, he must have really not been very happy about any of that. In the meantime, on the continent of Europe, a fellow by the name of Martin Luther, a Catholic priest, tacks up his 95 Theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg. These are statements, if you will, of how the church, the Roman Catholic Church, is flawed and needs to be changed. This begins the process of what we later call the Reformation. Okay. And while Reformation sounds like you're changing the Catholic Church, that's not what really happened. What happened is Martin Luther eventually broke from the Roman Church and, well, created a whole new thing, which, that we could call it Lutheranism, but, Protestantism, however you want to talk about it, right? So Martin Luther begins his work in 1517. There is a lot of hostility to this. Don't get me wrong. There are wars. In fact, Henry VIII, sponsors armies to go and fight against these people. Okay. And again, it's terribly complicated. I know I'm oversimplifying. But Henry's also got a problem at home. No boy. So eventually, and it doesn't happen overnight, but eventually he separates from the Roman Church, creates what he calls the Church of England. And guess what? In the Church of England, the king can get an annulment. He gets an annulment, marries Anne Boleyn. She produces a girl, also Elizabeth. Can't divorce Anne Boleyn. Eventually, he just has her executed. Right? Here, Henry goes through a series of wives. Eventually, Jane Seymour produces a child, a boy, Edward. So when Henry VIII dies, Edward takes over, but Edward doesn't last very long at all. He died. People died. Queen Mary, the Catholic Mary, comes to the throne. So she's one of the people we're reading. And you should read about her and her attempts to restore Catholicism. The efforts of which earned her the title Bloody Mary. Eventually, however, she dies without an heir. That's a whole other long story. Because she was married to a Spanish king who, it's kind of hard when, king's in Madrid or Toledo. I'm not sure where the capital of Spain was at that time. She's in London. Hard to get together and have a baby. And so when she dies, her half-sister, Elizabeth, comes to the throne. She comes to the throne in 1558. Pardon me, and rules, of course, for a very long time. As a single woman, the Virgin Queen, although we only have her word for it, never marries, and thus never has any children. That creates issues for another time that we need to talk about. But this first week that we're looking into the English Reformation, the section is Women in Power. And you have a section of stuff written by Mary Tudor, Queen Mary the First. There's also Mary, Queen of Scots, who's had some wonderful film representations, who is a rival to Queen Elizabeth. Also Lady Jane Grey, who kind of is on the throne for about 9 days, but it's just the whole thing's a mess. Doesn't work. And she winds up getting executed for her efforts, which were really not even her own efforts. Right? She becomes essentially a footnote to history. So those four women, Mary Tudor, becoming Queen Mary the First, Lady Jane Grey, Mary Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I. These are the women I want you to read. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I think these are the pieces that we have or anything but what they are. They're more historical. They're not, like Othello, right? They're not, Faustus, that kind of thing. They're not the sonnets, although there is some poetry. But the importance of these women, besides the fact that they just simply existed in this time period, is that they created a situation where here you had this country in a time, quite frankly, where we were still dominated by men, and they're at the top, or they want to be at the top. And that by itself pretty darn interesting.